Before starting, if the story is interesting, please comment 1 and subscribe. If not, please comment 2 so I can change. I am Malene Brennan. I have consistently been the reliable individual within my family, the one who receives the call when assistance is required, always intervening regardless of the circumstances. This has been my role for as long as I can recall, perhaps due to my upbringing in a household where familial bonds were paramount. We had just enough to maintain basic necessities, yet we were united. My parents toiled diligently, with my mother balancing 2 jobs and my father enduring long hours in construction. As the youngest of 4 siblings, I endeavored to foster harmony in a home that was as tumultuous as it was affectionate. I quickly acquired the ability to resolve issues, whether by aiding my brothers with their academic assignments or listening to my sister lament over a heartbreak. I was their confidant, a role I embraced and appreciated. I appreciated being the individual upon whom others relied, the one capable of improving situations. As I matured, I retained this role. I attended college, became a guidance counselor, and dedicated my days to listening to others' issues and assisting them in navigating their paths. I cherished this work and believed I excelled at it. I believed that my goal was to assist others. But when my sister Chloe lost her spouse, Jet, who was only 12 at the time, a young kid forced to mature prematurely, it became evident that Chloe, despite her efforts, was devastated by her loss and needed support. Jet did so, and so did I. I did not hesitate. He needed steadiness. Initially, I provided assistance with minor tasks such as transporting him from soccer practice, aiding him with his homework, and ensuring he had necessary items in Chloe's absence. However, over time, my involvement deepened. I attended every game, every school play, and every parent-teacher conference. I became the person he contacted when distressed, the individual he trusted for conversations. I believed I was providing assistance. I believed I was doing it correctly, although trust is a delicate matter. It requires years to establish trust, yet a single moment or decision can obliterate it entirely. At the time, I failed to recognize, or perhaps I was unwilling to acknowledge, that the distinctions were fading. What I perceived as love and support was, in fact, something entirely different. This narrative recounts how I shattered that trust, how I transgressed boundaries I should never have breached, and how I inflicted pain on someone I cherish above all else. It is not a tale I take pride in sharing, but it is the truth. If recounting it serves to prompt even one individual to reflect before committing the same errors I did, then perhaps it holds value. Jet held his mother, Chloe, in the highest regard. She was the anchor of his existence, a parent who maximized every moment, consistently supporting him at soccer matches, assisting with projects late into the night, and comforting him during thunderstorms, aware of his aversion to the sound of rain against the windows. Their bond was exceptional, unyielding, but existence remains indifferent to connections. Chloe's life abruptly ended. She was driving home late one night after completing a double shift at the hospital, fatigued. The day had been lengthy, and then there came the intoxicated motorist. He disregarded a red traffic signal, and in a second, Chloe was lost. Jet was but 12 years old. I will never forget the call. It was nearly midnight when the phone rang, startling me. Upon answering, I discovered it was Curtis Clark, a family friend who had been contacted by the police. His voice trembled as he uttered the words, "She didn't make it." My heart sank, and I was consumed with the dilemma of how to convey this devastating news to Jet. How does one explain to a boy that his entire world is gone? When I arrived at the house, Jet sat on the couch, knees drawn to his chest, fixated on the front door as if awaiting her return. He did not cry initially. He remained silent and disoriented. As I kneeled before him and informed him of her passing, it was as if the light in his eyes extinguished. He said not a word, and simply collapsed into my embrace, sobbing so intensely that I feared he might shatter. From that moment onward, I became everything to Jet, as his father had been absent for years. He departed when Jet was still a toddler. Chloe had single-handedly reared him, and now that she was gone, there was no one behind. I intervened because it was necessary. He required my assistance, and I was determined not to disappoint him. Are you guys still listening? Press 1 to let me know you're still listening. Initially, my focus was on the essentials, ensuring he had sustenance, clothing, and a secure environment for rest. However, the situation rapidly escalated. He became increasingly distressed and struggled to manage his emotions. He ceased communication with his peers, his academic performance deteriorated, and he transformed into a mere shadow of the boy he once was, consumed by anger. In a world filled with anger against the driver who stole his mother and maybe even directed at her for abandoning him, akin to his father's departure 6 months after Chloe's death, he ultimately shattered his quiet. While assisting him with his mathematics assignment, he unexpectedly said, "It's not fair." She was all I had, his voice trembling. He gazed at me with tears in his eyes, questioning why she had to go. What transgression did I do that rendered me shattered upon hearing those words? I intended to convey to him that it was not his responsibility. At times, the world may be very harsh. Nonetheless, I saw that only words would be insufficient. Thus, I took the only action available to me. I embraced him and reassured him. "I am here, Jet. You are not alone." From that day onward, I endeavored to fill the void left by Chloe. I attended every soccer match, assisted with every academic project, and ensured he felt cherished. However, I was not Chloe. Despite my efforts, I could not replicate her presence. Perhaps this is where the fissures began. Jet relied on me for everything, contacting me for even the most trivial matters, such as selecting attire for picture day or seeking assistance with school challenges. He even began to forego outings with friends to spend additional time with me. Stating, "You are the only person I can confide in." "Aunt Malene," he said to me once, his voice heavy with gratitude and sadness, "you actually listening to those words made me feel like I was doing the right thing, like I was giving him something no one else could. But not everyone saw it that way." Curtis, my cousin and one of the few family members who still kept in touch, started expressing concern. "You're doing an amazing job," he said one day over coffee, his tone cautious, "but yet needs to learn how to stand on his own 2 feet. He's leaning on you for everything, and that's not healthy for either of you." At the time, I brushed him off, I told myself. Curtis didn't understand what Jet had been through, that he didn't see how much Jet needed me. But looking back now, I realized he was right. I wasn't just helping Jet. I was holding on to him too tightly, trying to be everything for him because I didn't know how to let go, and in doing so, I blurred lines that should never have been blurred. I didn't see it then, but the cracks were already forming, cracks in Jet's ability to grow, cracks in my judgment. Cracks in a bond that, while built on love, was slowly becoming something it never should have been yet, was changing. I started noticing it when he turned 15. His voice deepened, his frame broadened, and the quiet, shy boy I'd spent years protecting was slowly becoming someone new. Someone I didn't fully recognize. It should have made me proud, and in a way it did. But it also terrified me. He was growing up, pulling away from the safe, little world we'd built together. And I didn't know where that would leave me at first. It was subtle. He started spending more time in his room, shutting the door. When he used to leave it open, he laughed at my jokes less and brushed off my offers to help with his homework, and spent hours scrolling on his phone instead of talking to me like he used to. I told myself it was normal that all teenagers go through phases like this, but it didn't stop the ache in my chest every time he chose solitude over my company. Then he met Scarlett Larson. She was his classmate, intelligent, extroverted, and easily captivating in the manner typical of 15-year-old females. But he could not refrain from discussing her. Every other phrase pertained to something amusing Scarlett had said in class, or her proficiency in soccer. For the first time in years, he seemed really happy, and I ought to have felt joy for him. Yet, a knot tightened in my stomach whenever her name was spoken. It seems as if I am losing. I confided in Curtis one day. Upon his visit for coffee, he no longer required my presence. Curtis regarded me with a prolonged, contemplative gaze before replying, "Melina, it is beneficial that Jet is maturing. He is expected to want your assistance less." I did not vocalize this. However, it remains unspoken. Agree, I couldn't imagine a version of my life where Jet didn't need me. I didn't know who I was without him the first time it happened. It was an accident, or at least that's what I told myself. He had stayed up late working on a project for school, and I found him asleep on the couch. Papers scattered around him. I went to drape a blanket over him like I'd done 100 times before, but this time I hesitated. His shirt had ridden up slightly, revealing a sliver of his lower back. My hand froze, lingering for just a moment too long, and something inside me shifted. I felt a rush of guilt so strong it made my chest tighten, but I ignored it and tucked him in and went. But it was little. Moments like that, small, fleeting instances that seemed harmless at the time, but added up to something much touching on his shoulder that lingered a beat too long. A compliment that felt a little too personally. I convinced myself it was innocent, that I was just being affectionate, but deep down I knew better the first time we crossed the line. It was in the kitchen, had just come home from soccer practice, sweaty and exhausted, but still grinning from ear to ear. He was talking about how Scarlett had scored the winning goal, his excitement filling the room, and I couldn't stop staring at his face. His hair damp, and there was something about the way he looked at me, so open, so trusting, that it made my heart race. I don't know what came over me. 1 minute we were laughing, and the next I was leaning in. I kissed him. It was swift, merely a fleeting contact of my lips against his, but it was sufficient to render him immobile. His eyes widened in astonishment, and for a brief time I believed he would withdraw, but he approached me firmly, his gaze almost penetrating mine. "What are we doing?" he inquired, and before I could respond, he grasped my waist and drew me near, his enticing lips pressed against mine. Before we comprehended the situation, I found myself lying flat on the floor with Jet atop me. He hastily unbuckled his belt while I removed my pants. Rational thought had abandoned us both. He touched my left leg and gradually slid his fingers to my waist while kissing and licking my neck. I gasped audibly and hugged him firmly. It was my most profound experience with Jet, however inappropriate, aired. I ought to have intervened, although I was unable to resist him at that time. Subsequently, everything changed. We convinced ourselves it was not immoral, and that it caused no harm if undisclosed, but the reality was that it was really wrong. I was aware of it, and I believe Jet was as well. We convinced ourselves and normalized the experience. It felt satisfactory until I overheard a conversation between Jet and his best friend Bryson. They had met at school a few months after our affair, and around this time Jet began confiding in Bryson. Bryson Blackwell was a youth who exhibited wisdom beyond his years, consistently providing advice that seemed excessively mature for a 16-year-old. Jet trusted him, perhaps even more than he trusted me, and I could sense it was beginning to burden him. One evening, I unintentionally overheard their discussion in his room. I had not intended to eavesdrop, but their voices permeated through the thin walls of the house. "I do not know what to do," Jet stated. His voice was subdued and laden with exasperation. "I feel compelled to continue, although I am uncertain whether I still want it." Bryson inquired, "What do you mean?" "It is excessive. I feel as if I no longer recognize my identity. She is always there, and I am overwhelmed to the point of suffocation. After a prolonged silence, Bryson said, "You must inform her. Inform her that you need distance. This situation is unhealthy, and you are aware of it, correct?" "Cannot," Jet said, his voice trembling. "I do not want to. To inflict pain onto her, she is my only possession, Bryson." With a sigh, I acknowledged the necessity for both our well-being. Hearing those words struck me like a blow to the abdomen. I realized I was not only inflicting pain upon myself, but also upon Jet. However, I was at a loss regarding how to cease this cycle or relinquish the one thing that provided me with a sense of completeness. The dynamics between Jet and me had been strained for some time, yet I remained in denial. He increasingly withdrew, spending hours confined to his room or socializing with Bryson and Scarlett. The brief moments we once cherished, such as sharing laughter over a movie, became increasingly rare. I convinced myself it was merely a transient phase and that he would return to me as he had in the past. Yet deep within I sensed the widening chasm, which filled me with dread. One evening I found myself perusing through photographs. While perusing my phone, I discovered photographs of Jet from his youth, a time when life was more simple. One image captured him on his 13th birthday, beaming at the camera with cake smeared over his face. I reflected on the significant changes that had transpired, the sacrifices I had made for him, and my desire for him to be near. I failed to recognize the extent of my selfishness as he increasingly devoted time to Scarlett, which was exasperating me. Upon returning home from school, he would scarcely utter 2 words before departing to meet her. One evening, he disclosed that she had invited him to a party over the weekend. I could discern the enthusiasm in his voice, yet all I experienced was panic. "Are you certain that is a prudent course of action?" I inquired. "I am attempting to maintain a neutral tone. At your age, behavior may become unruly, but I saw a glance from her that was unprecedented, a blend of displeasure and disappointment. It is only a party. Aunt Meline and Scarlett's parents will be there, so it is not significant. However, what if he were to sever ties with me? Why can't I have an independent life? You need not concern yourself with me, Aunt Meline. I am no longer a child. I became immobilized." He had never addressed me in such a manner before, and it hurt more than I was willing to acknowledge. "I am merely trying to look out for you," I said softly. He sighed, massaging the nape of his neck. "I understand, but it feels as though... I don't know, I must go see you." The talk concluded in the morning. It remained with me that night. I was unable to sleep. His words incessantly echoed in my mind. Why can't I have an independent life? I recognized his correctness. I had been clinging too firmly, fearing that if I released him, he would go entirely. The tension culminated in her mind. A few days later, Jet returned. From hanging out with Bryson, and I could tell something was off. He barely looked at me as he walked past. Heading straight for his room, I followed him, knocking lightly on the door before pushing it hey. I said softly, "You okay?" Didn't answer right away. He was sitting on the edge of his bed, his head in his hands when he finally looked up at me. His eyes were filled with something I couldn't quite place. Hurt, anger, maybe even fear. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but steady. My stomach dropped. "Okay," I said, sitting down, in the chair across from him. "What's going on?" He took a deep breath, and for a moment I thought he might change his mind. But then he spoke, and his words hit me like a punch to the gut. "And I don't even know how to tell you this. But I felt like I couldn't say no to you for a long time." He said, his voice shaking, "It's like I don't have a choice, and it's killing me." I stared at him, stunned. "Jet, I don't understand." He looked away, his jaw tightening. I've been trying to figure it out for months why I feel this way, why I keep going along with things I don't want to do. And I think it's because I don't want to disappoint you. But I can't do this anymore. His words hung in the air. Heavy and suffocating, I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that everything we'd done had been mutual consensual. But deep down, I knew he was right. I'd crossed lines that never should have been crossed. And now I was watching the fallout in real time after he left the room. I sat there for what felt like hours replaying the conversation over and over in my head. How had I let it get this far? How had I convinced myself that what I was doing was okay? The weight of it all was unbearable. And I knew I couldn't carry it alone the next day I called Rebecca Pina, my best friend since college. She'd always been the one person I could count on to tell me the truth, no matter how hard it was to hear when I told her everything. She didn't hold back. You need to take a hard look at yourself. Malene, she said, her voice firm but not unkind. You can't repair this unless you own up. To it, all of it, I know. I whispered, tears streaming down my face. I just don't know how to fix it. You can't fix it overnight, she said, but the first step is letting Jet go. He needs space to figure out who he is without you, and you need to figure out who you are without her. Words were like a slap to the face. But she was right. I turned the poor boy into someone he never wanted to be, and I hated myself for it. A few days later, Jet told me he needed space. He said he wasn't angry, but he needed time to think, to process everything. Hearing those words broke me, but I knew they were necessary as much as it hurt. I had to let him go. I spent days replaying Jet's words in my head over and over, until they felt like they were etched into my bones. I don't even know how to tell you this, but I felt like I couldn't say no to you for a long time. Each time the weight of what I had done grew heavier, suffocating me for years. I'd convinced myself that what we shared was mutual and that I was helping him, loving him in the way he needed. But now all I could see was how much I had hurt him. I wanted to fix it, to make things right. But every time I tried to reach out, I froze. What could I possibly say that would erase the pain I'd caused? Every word felt inadequate, like trying to patch a broken dam with a piece of tape. I knew I couldn't just leave things as they thought. Jet deserved an apology. At the very least, he deserved to hear me take responsibility. So I wrote him a letter, Dear Jet. I don't even know where to start. How do I begin to apologize for something I can't even fully explain to myself? All I know is that I've hurt you in ways I never intended, and for that I am so deeply sorry. When your mom died, I made a promise to myself that I would protect you no matter what. I thought I was doing that, but somewhere along the way I lost sight of what that really meant. I crossed lines that never should have been crossed, and in doing so I took away something I can never give back: your trust. You said you felt like you couldn't say no to me. And that broke me, because the last thing I ever wanted was for you to feel trapped, to feel like you didn't have a choice. I can't change what's already happened. But I can promise you this. From now on, I will respect your boundaries. I will give you the space you need to figure out who you are without me hovering over you. I'm not asking for forgiveness because I don't deserve it. But I do hope that one day you'll be able to look back on the good memories we shared and know that even though I failed you in so many ways, I always loved you. I'm so sorry, Jet. For everything, love, Aunt Malene. I left the letter on his desk one morning while he was out with Bryson. I didn't expect a response. At least not right away, but the waiting was unbearable. My phone buzzed. My heart jumped, only to sink when I realized it wasn't him. Days turned into weeks, and still nothing. I started to wonder if I'd lost him for good. Then one evening there was a knock. On the door, I opened it to find Jet standing there, looking older than his 19 years. He had the letter in his hand, folded and creased like he'd read it 100 times. For a moment we just stared at each other, neither of us knowing what to say. "We talk?" finally asked, his voice quiet and steady. He nodded and stepped aside to let him enter. We sat down in the living room, the quiet extending between us like a chasm. Eventually, he shattered the stillness. He expressed his contemplation, gazing at the letter about our relationship and all associated matters, and he questioned if circumstances would ever revert to their previous state. His comments were painful, although I recognize their veracity. "I do not anticipate that they will." Said gently, "I only like for you to understand that I am present. Whatever you want, be it space, time, or absence, I will honor it." He gazed at me, and for the first time in what seemed like eternity, a trace of the child I once knew flickered in his eyes. "I am willing to attempt to rebuild," he said, "but it will necessitate time. That is everything I could ever request." I answered, my voice slightly cracking, and we sat there for a bit. While not expressing much, there was a cautious but optimistic sharing of space. It was not a conclusion per se, rather it resembled a delicate and unsure beginning. Although I would like to conclude the narrative there, the reality is that I cannot understand the subsequent events. I am now attempting to comprehend how circumstances have deteriorated to this extent and how to progress. I acknowledge my significant errors, which may be irreparable, but I am determined to strive for improvement, both for myself and for the opportunity to enhance my situation. Therefore, I now want your assistance. What actions should one take after causing harm to a loved one? How can one atone for an act deemed unforgivable? I lack the solutions, but perhaps you possess insights, whether from personal experience or not. What would your approach be to rectify such a situation? I invite you to share your reflections in the comments below, as I am eager to learn, listen, and evolve. Additionally, if this narrative resonated with you or provoked contemplation, I would appreciate your endorsement of this video. Your support not only signifies your presence, but also enhances the likelihood of this story reaching others who may benefit from it. Share this video with them, and remember to subscribe. This is not the conclusion of my trip, and I would like you to be involved as we progress together. Thank you for your presence and participation in this discourse. Your views and observations are invaluable. Then you are aware